Estimadas amigas y amigos del BICE, quiero darles la bienvenida a este encuentro, que es el primero de una serie de actividades que hemos llamado Puentes hacia el Futuro, y que quiere ser un espacio productivo de diálogo y conocimiento, que nos ayude a transitar con más información y seguridad hacia un futuro que se nos presenta incierto y al mismo tiempo sorprendente. Desde siempre, los seres humanos hemos visto nuestra existencia como un viaje cuyo destino es el futuro, y por eso tendemos a darle al presente un sentido de preparación. Es por ello que hoy queremos adquirir las herramientas que nos servirán para enfrentar los desafíos del mañana y vivir felices. En nuestra juventud, a esa preparación la llamamos educación. En las empresas es planificación, transformación, adaptación, y en la vida finalmente es eso que conocemos como sabiduría. En BICE trabajamos cada día para ayudar a nuestros clientes en ese viaje hacia el futuro. Por ello estamos inmersos en una profunda transformación cultural y digital, porque sabemos que allí está el medio ambiente, el lenguaje y el canal mediante el cual nos conectaremos cada día más. La pandemia ha sido un duro golpe, pero nos ha dejado aspectos muy positivos. Nos ha recordado cuánto queremos a nuestras familias, cuánto nos importa el contacto humano, ver, abrazar, sentir la presencia de quienes apreciamos. Pero también nos ha mostrado que en muchas dimensiones nos habíamos quedado estancados, que teníamos al alcance de la mano enormes oportunidades que no estábamos utilizando. Esta reunión de hoy es una muy buena demostración de ello. En BICE queremos ser más eficientes, pero no menos humanos. Queremos estar a la altura de lo que cada uno de ustedes espera de nosotros. Para eso estamos trabajando hoy en las mejores respuestas a las preguntas que ustedes nos harán mañana. Esto es el sentido de nuestro proceso de transformación digital. Un cambio que está incorporando los medios del futuro a nuestra relación personal de siempre. Hoy escucharemos a dos académicos e intelectuales de primer nivel. Uno chileno, un amigo a quien apreciamos y que entre nosotros no necesita presentación. Andrés Velasco, economista de vasta formación académica, PhD en la Universidad de Columbia, también exministro de Hacienda y actualmente decano del Instituto de Políticas Públicas del London School of Economics. Andrés conversará con Goldin, doctor y profesor de la Universidad de Oxford, autor del famoso libro The Butterfly Defect, que nos habla de riesgos como pandemia, inequidad y ciberseguridad. Jan es de esas personas capaces de anticiparse, de mostrarnos una parte del futuro hacia el que caminamos. Los invito a disfrutar esta conversación. Muchas de las ideas que escucharemos constituyen los pilares de ese puente que nos permitirá hacer de mejor manera nuestro viaje hacia ese futuro que nos espera lleno de oportunidades. Bienvenidos y muchas gracias por su confianza y compromiso con nosotros.
It's a pleasure to be talking with BICE and all the community in Chile about how COVID-19 has changed the world and what we may expect in the future resulting from this biggest health and economic emergency that we've experienced in our lifetimes. For me, this is the pandemic that changes the world. And it's difficult to think of any dimension of the future affected by it. For all people in all countries, and certainly for all Chilenos. The pandemic is not a surprise. I predicted it in my 2014 book, The Butterfly Defect, and again every year since then, including in a BBC series I did after the crash, where the final episode I suggested that the next financial crisis would come from a pandemic, and that was in 2018. And the reason it's not a surprise is that globalization not only brings many, many good things, but also real dangers. The connectors of the goods are also the connectors of the bads. The super spreaders of the benefit are also simultaneously the super spreaders of the threats. Our great financial centers spread economic opportunities around the world. They spread investment. They spread foreign exchange and facilitate trade. And yet, these same financial centers became the super spread of a global financial crisis. What started in the Midwest of the US in 2007, 2008, spread around the world almost overnight from those centers. And of course, cyber attacks, we know, spread almost instantaneously around the world through the internet systems, which now connect over 5 billion people in the world. And what we've seen with the pandemic is, of course, that airport hubs, which bring so many benefits in terms of spreading travel, tourism, business communication, are also the spreaders of viruses around the world. The challenge for globalization is to harvest the benefits and make sure that we can stop the bads. Not only the bads like pandemics, like financial crises, like cyber viruses that spread, but also the unintended consequences of the many good things of globalization. As a result of globalization, over 2 billion people have escaped poverty over the last 30 years. This is incredible. There has never been a force which has brought so many benefits so quickly to so many people. And globalization, I mean the spreading across national borders of ideas, of investments, of trade, of vaccines, and of people and technologies. And it's that which allows us to have this conversation today, me sitting in my Oxford home and you listening wherever you are. That's the benefit of globalization. This progressive force is what's driving change around the world. It's what's accelerating change around the world. And if we stop it, we stop progress. So I do not believe we should allow COVID-19 to lead to a reaction which is to try to build higher walls, to try to cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. Nationalism and protectionism are grave danger to all of us. We need more flows. We need more scientific collaboration to create vaccines. We need more scientific collaborations to stop the next pandemic. We need more coordination of experts to stop cascading financial crises. And we need more global regulation to stop fake news and the manipulation of elections around the world by foreign powers. We need more connected, not less connected countries, and especially connected in terms of harvesting the benefits of globalization and stopping the bads. But globalization needs to be managed. It needs to be regulated. And clearly, we cannot come out of COVID-19 and say, let's go back to business as usual. Because business as usual has brought us to where we are today. Business as usual has brought us the pandemic. Business as usual has brought us climate change. Business as usual is leading to growing inequality. Business as usual is unsustainable. And so my hope is that we can learn from this pandemic to create a better globalization, a more inclusive globalization, that we recognize that no country, no matter how powerful, whether it's China, the US, or other, can go forward on their own. That we're only as strong in our global economy and as humanity as we are with our weakest links. We need to worry about people everywhere around the world. We need to worry about what's happening in far-off places. We need to ensure that this is the last pandemic. And that requires we devote much more resources to it. We devote about 1,000th, a tiny, tiny fraction of the amount of resource that we devote to the military to stopping pandemics. And yet, any expert will tell us that the threat of pandemics to our lives, to our economies, is much greater than that of a military threat. We need to stop looking in the rearview mirror and focus on the threats that face us in the future. And clearly pandemics can be stopped and must be stopped by more actions nationally, but principally by reinforcing the WHO and other global institutions that have that role. We also need to stop change and the other threats that face us. To create a more inclusive world requires that we focus on the big picture, but we also need to focus at home. This pandemic is leading to a historic opportunity. Interest rates are at record lows. I believe they will remain at this level for a very long time. And that creates opportunities for increasing investment and, of course, for leverage, for debt. And that needs to be spent wisely by investing in the future, by the transformation to a green economy, by the creation of jobs. The future of work is more uncertain than ever because the pandemic has also accelerated the automation of jobs and the transfer of jobs from people to machines. What's been happening with globalization is being compressed into an accelerated timescale. That is the coming back to the rich countries and to the big markets of manufacturing processes and service processes done through artificial and automated processes. The days of benefiting from labor-intensive production are over. And that means that we increasingly need to rely on skills. If we're going to benefit in countries like Chile from globalization of activities around the world, it will be the benefiting through increasing use of our skills and knowledge at rates which are highly competitive with those around the world. What we, I think, face is a real challenge. My group in Oxford has predicted that up to half of US workers are vulnerable over the next 20 years from and other processes. So we need, as we invest in education and skills, about what are the jobs of the future. And as we look to countries like Chile, the investments in education, the investments in the professional services that can be done more effectively in Chile than they can do in London or New York or elsewhere. If one is doing remote work, the question is, why do you need to do it in the same country? And what COVID-19 has accelerated is the ability for remote working. So this could be first that people don't have to go to the office in London. They can stay in their homes, whether they're bankers or lawyers or other professions. But of course, they could equally be in Chile and elsewhere doing the job. And on the same time zone, like with the US, that becomes even easier. So the future of work is going to look very different where it's done, how it's done, and who does it. And that creates an opportunity as well as an enormous risk. The macroeconomic balances are changing dramatically. We've seen today, in August, things that are mainstream, which in January this year would have been totally unacceptable. The levels of deficit and debt of governments, what governments are doing to support firms and people. But of course, rich countries can afford this and have given $8 trillion of support, whereas for middle income and low income countries, that level of support is not an option. And so we need to recognize going forward that there's going to have to be a restructuring of societies, a rethinking of comparative and competitive advantages. And with that, where do we fit into globalization, which increasingly will have a center of gravity over East Asia, and in that, not only a center of gravity over East Asia, but globalization increasingly with Chinese capital. The US will become a less and less significant leader of the global economy. Already, its economy is no longer going to be the largest, And as the center of economic gravity moves, as Asia comes out of this pandemic quickest, East Asia particularly, comes out quickest, and as it embraces globalization, which is bringing it so many benefits, Chile is well placed on the Pacific seaboard. Chile is well placed because it's not only able to benefit from the growth of Asia in terms of the exports of services, tourism, products, materials, not least copper, but also because it's able to play the neutral role. The Cold War 2.0 brewing between the US and China is very dangerous for the world. It will slow global growth. It will certainly be most negative for the US, which I believe will have a very long period of very poor growth, both because of the impact of COVID-19 on the economy and because of its self-destructive political processes on protectionism and nationalism. Of course, there's going to be an election in November, and that might yield a different presidential outcome. However, there's bipartisan support in the antagonism to China and on many other key dimensions of the economic agenda. So I believe increasingly we will see this drift to East Asia as the center of gravity. Europe playing a middle ground, caught between the two, and the UK, rather like the US, becoming less and less the global leader that it was. Brexit, bad handling of the pandemic, and other self-inflicted wounds also undermining the UK's growth potential. In that world, like Chile, can redefine its place. Latin America has not done as well as one would have hoped. And of course, in the neighborhood are some very poor performers in terms of COVID-19, and this will have a devastating impact on their economies. But Chile is an outward-looking economy. It's benefited hugely in the past, and I believe can continue to do so. In this environment, where the macroeconomy is transforming, where we're moving into a more Keynesian sort of world, in this world where governments will play a stronger role, in a world where people realize that we need governments when risks are tough, as they are with COVID and climate change, in that world, government will need more resources. And so governments around the world are going to be facing the challenge of sustainability in terms of their fiscal deficits, and this is going to put a lot of pressure on young people. Investing in young people is one of the key takeaways from COVID. Young people, as they did in the Second World War, are sacrificing to keep elderly people like me healthy, sacrificing their social lives, their education, their job prospects, and inheriting larger debts. And so the challenge for all of us is to create a world of hope, a world where we can say to the younger generation, we are investing in your future. We are investing not only in the education systems, the health systems, but the politics which will build nationally and internationally a better response to the great challenges we face, be they climate change, be they pandemics, or be they others. We can say to the youth that their job prospects will be enhanced. And that challenge on all of us, as was the challenge during the Second World War, requires deep thinking and leadership from business. Business has a special role to play. It can have the capacity and, of course, its actions on the ground to make a difference. Business, not governments, create incomes and growth. Businesses, together with government, invest for the future. And it's through that quality of investment, whether it meets environmental sustainability and governance, whether businesses are seen as the good place to be to invest in the future, whether young people want to work for them, not because they have to get a job, but because they believe that businesses will create a better world. Creating that role model, creating that belief that one can invest and do good for the world, that can hold shares in a company, and by holding shares, allow the company to grow and progress. It's that belief that depends on the quality of business leadership. I'm proud to be involved in many businesses as a non-executive director and also in the B team and International Chamber of Commerce and other initiatives. And we know there's a vast range of behavior amongst businesses. But it's through the actions of the leaders of the businesses, through the role model that they set, through the forcing of standards through the institutions, through the zero toleration of corruption, of pollution, and of other activities, that businesses develop their reputations. So this is a challenging time. It's a challenging time for all of us. We are seeing the underbelly of globalization. And, of course, it's one which has been accompanied by rising inequality and tensions within countries and between them. COVID-19 is laying bare the underlying weaknesses in the system. It is exploiting them, it's exacerbating them. And so it's particularly important for all of those that care in a better future, that we seize this moment. We're at a T-junction for humanity. On the one hand is a downward spiral, where we, within our countries, have growing inequality, growing use of fossil fuels, unsustainable use of the environment, higher levels of pollution, lower levels of growth, and rising tensions, and internationally, failure to cooperate with others, which leads to even worse pandemics, rising climate change, and a much less safe and unstable world. And unless we act, that will happen. On the other hand, we can make a choice, as was made by the leaders of businesses and of governments in the midst of the Second World War, to create a new world, to create a better world, to seize this opportunity to ensure the suffering is not in vain, and that inspired by our lessons from COVID-19, things go forward, not to build back what was there before, because business as usual is not sustainable, but to build back in a much better way. Then they created the United Nations system, the Bretton Woods, the Marshall Plan, the welfare state. And the question for us in our generation now is, what are we going to leave as our legacy of this terrible experience? Are we able to rise to this? We are being tested. Are we able to rise to this, to create better society, more inclusive societies? And as countries, are we able to not build higher walls, which will make us all worse off, but to cooperate with others, to stop the next pandemic, once we've overcome this one, to stop climate change, and to ensure that for our own sakes, and for those of our children and their children, we create a better world. Thank you.
Hello, thank you to BICE for this invitation, and I'm delighted to be sharing this virtual stage with my friend Ian Goldin from Oxford University. As an economist, I've been studying economic and financial crises for a lifetime, but I have never seen, I don't think the world has seen, a crisis like the one we're living through today. Because we've seen all kinds of reasons for an economy to come to a stop, but we never had a situation in which government told workers to go home and in which government told businesses not to operate. And this is what makes this crisis unique. It makes it difficult to deal with, and I will conjecture it'll make it long-lived as well. Now, if that is the problem worldwide for emerging market economies, and especially for Latin America, the focus of my remarks today, this is not just one crisis, it is really 5 crises or 5 shocks feeding into one crisis. First of all, you've got the pandemic, what economists might call a supply shock. Economists simply cannot produce because people cannot leave their homes, they cannot get to work. In addition, you had a massive commodity shock for nations like Chile and many others in Latin America that export commodities. Prices fell, they've recovered a little bit, but they're way below where they used to be before the pandemic. Next, you have a trade volume shock. The World Trade Organization is forecasting that trade volumes for Latin America could fall by as much as 1/3 during this year. Then you've got a shock of lowered or disappearing remittances, which is not so important for Chile, but which is very important for Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America. Workers abroad are simply not sending as much money home as they used to. And last but certainly not least, and this is probably the biggest shock of them all, capital flows have turned, and before the pandemic, we were having ongoing capital inflows into the region. More recently, we've had massive outflows. We had a real temper tantrum in March and April. There's been a bit of a recovery since, but the recovery is really a bit misleading because it is the governments that are borrowing abroad and bringing dollars to Latin America. The private sector is mostly leaving. So capital flows are not part of a happy picture either. Now, if this is such a big shock, the next natural question is, how long will the shock last? How quickly will the recovery come? I tend to be on the pessimistic side in answering these questions for a number of reasons. The first one is that Latin America has done pretty poorly when it comes to containing the pandemic. This is to some extent the result of misguided government policies. I think countries like Brazil and Mexico stand out as examples of what you should not do in response to the pandemic. But it is also simply a revelation of basic structural difficulties and weaknesses. It is easy to tell people not to go to work when you are a well-off middle-class society in which everybody has a refrigerator and in which you can order food to be delivered at home. When people have informal jobs, when they live hand to mouth, when they have little savings, when they have, and not the case in Chile, but in other countries in Latin America where half the population does not even have a refrigerator, it is very, very difficult to tell people to stay home. And as a result, lockdown policies have been much less effective. Hospital infrastructure is weaker. The contagion has been more sustained. And while much of the world is very much on a downward trajectory when it comes to containment of the pandemic, Latin America is still near the peak, maybe turning around, but not quite there yet. So the first conjecture, an educator conjecture, I think, is that because the sanitary part of the solution has been so slow in coming to Latin America, the economic recovery will be delayed as well. The second reason why I think that recovery will be slow is that Latin America will come out of this crisis needing a lot of structural change. A few months ago, people were optimistic. They thought, well, maybe the crisis will come and go, but businesses, activities, sectors will remain pretty much the same. Today, I think it is pretty evident that the crisis has been long enough so that whole sectors, hospitality, air transport, tourism, are not quite wiped out, but they've suffered substantial damage. Many of those firms probably will not survive. There will have to be labor reallocation. That happens, but it happens over time, and it is often a painful adjustment. Last but not least, Latin America will come out of this crisis with a lot of debt. Governments will have a great deal more debt. Even governments like Peru and Chile, where initial debt levels were pretty low, will come out with 10, 15, 20% of GDP in additional public debt. And of course, the private sector will come out a great deal more indebted. And we know from previous crises and previous low recoveries that when you have a lot of debt, then inevitably the recovery is slower. So yes, in the next few months, we will get numbers that maybe begin to look good toward the end of the year. We will see headlines that say GDP rose by 3%, by 4%, but we should not forget that those numbers will come on the heels of other previous figures that were showing drops of 10, 15, 20%. Put differently, I think it will be a year and a half, maybe 2 years, before most countries in the region, Chile included, come to the level of economic activity that we had, say, in December of last year or in the middle of last year before the pandemic. In addition, I think unemployment will be a very big issue. We know that many people have lost jobs. In countries like Chile, this process has been contained somewhat by the use of unemployment insurance mechanisms, but Chile is pretty much alone in Latin America. We're the only country that has this kind of thing. But inevitably, when the August or September unemployment figures are out, and that will not happen until October or November, we're going to be seeing very, very, very high unemployment, probably the highest unemployment that we have seen since the debt crises of the 1980s and for some countries, early 1990s. And of course, the unemployment problem will come at a time when technological and structural change is destroying jobs anyway, because automation is coming to the region, robots are coming to the region. And you don't have to be a technological pessimist. I am not. I think that in the long run, technology creates new jobs. But of course, between the moment that new jobs are created and the moment earlier when old jobs are destroyed, there is a period of churning, a period of difficulty. If that happens in the midst of a boom, perhaps you will not notice it. If that happens in the middle of a big recession, like the one Chile and Latin America are going to go through for the next 18 months or so, then the pain will be increased. So I think the starting point is going to be one of great economic challenges and a pretty slow recovery. There may be opportunities here. I think one opportunity is that several structural deficiencies that we knew we had have been revealed to be even more glaring and even more painful than we knew. I'll give you one example: informality in the labor market. I think this crisis has made it abundantly clear that when you have such levels of informality in the labor market, maybe 25, 30% in the case of Chile, but as much as 50 or 60% in other countries of the region, that is very bad for workers. It is also very bad for the economy, and it is also very bad at a time of crisis. Because if you don't have a formal contract, you cannot provide unemployment insurance. Governments cannot step in and sustain wage levels, because if there's no contract, there's no wage. And many informal workers are not even in government roles. And as a result, if the government wants to do a cash transfer, support those families, it is very hard and very time-consuming to achieve that. And we've seen it all over Latin America, how difficult it is for governments to reach those families in need. So maybe we will get bigger consensus on reforms that are very much obviously needed, but politically very difficult to achieve. Labor market modernization, labor market reform is one of them. But of course, this will not be easy, because the politics of Latin America and the politics of the world at large are not going through a particularly peaceful or easy period. We live in an era of polarization. We live in an era of rising populism, both of the left-wing variety and of the right-wing variety. So maybe technical solutions to some of these problems will arise, but the big question in my mind is whether we will be able to forge the political consensus necessary to put these solutions to work. So in the end, I think it is not so much the economy stupid, as that famous Clinton advisor used to like to say. It is very much the politics stupid. And that means that whether we come out of this crisis politically more united or politically more divided is the biggest question of them all. Ian, in his remarks, mentioned the experience of the UK, the US, and Europe after World War II, and I think that's a very instructive point of comparison. Of course, in 1945, the suffering, destruction, and devastation was massive, but countries in the English-speaking world came out with a feeling of a shared national project. Of course, victory helps. There was greater social cohesion because the rich kid from Oxford, say, and the poor kid from a miner's family had fought together in the trenches in the same army for the same cause. The private sector had been mobilized in the war effort. So countries were damaged, countries were in pain, but countries were politically more cohesive and more united. By contrast, if you look at the financial crisis 10 years ago, maybe some of the policies, for instance, under Obama in the US, were quite adequate from a technical point of view, but the public perception was that Wall Street got a bailout, Main Street suffered, and therefore people felt that the system had not worked for them. So even though maybe the technical policies were okay, countries came out more divided, with worse income distribution and with much worse politics, as we have seen. So the big question going forward, and I will end here, is whether the world for the US, for the UK, but also for Latin America, will look like 1945. We've suffered, but we've come out of this feeling that we're in the same boat together, rowing in the same direction, or whether we will have greater division, greater inequality, and particularly more toxic and divisive politics. If the latter is the case, we will have a big shock from a political side, mounted atop what is already a big health shock and a big financial and economic shock. And in that case, I think the prospects for the world and the prospects for the region will look pretty dismal indeed. But the jury's still out. There's some chance the politics will improve. Let us hope that that will be the case. Let me stop there.
I greatly enjoyed Andreas's comments, and I completely agree with them, and also that it is the politics, stupid, not the economics. I think of two reasons which may be even worse than the situation that Andreas has outlined, but also a cause for optimism. I think what he didn't mention, which flows completely from what he said, was, of course, the currency shock as well, which emerging markets are experiencing. On average about 30%, and this is going to make foreign debt very expensive. The big factor that's happening is this brewing of the Cold War 2.0 between China and the US. And that makes for a very dangerous situation in terms of the future of trade, the future of the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and global governance, as well as the opportunities for emerging markets to go forward with a better trading and financial system. I think on the positive side, what I see is that East Asia, particularly China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, have emerged much quicker. And to the extent Chile is able to diversify, and to the extent that it's doing much better than other emerging markets, certainly much better than other emerging markets in Latin America, but also Africa, South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, I believe it'll be able to capitalize on that. Copper's done extremely well in its rebound. I think agricultural commodities that Chile exports will do well. And so I think it is an opportunity for Chile to distinguish itself if it can navigate this environment. The choices are stark. And when we talk about the good outcome of the Second World War, of course, I always think about the very bad outcome of the First World War, where populism did dominate. We had an even worse situation coming out of that, of bitter conflict between those that had been vanquished and the victors, and then, of course, a Great Depression and an even worse war. I hope we learn that lesson and don't go down that road again.
I very much hope you're right. I tend to agree with you, but having been gloomy in my initial remarks, let me be a bit more optimistic. let me begin with the last thing you said, which I think is very important. It is true that East Asia is doing much better than the rest of the world. Mostly, of course, because they managed to get the virus under control much quicker than the rest of the world. And this is good news for Chile, and you're seeing it already. If you divide GDP in Chile between mining and non-mining, mining is doing better to some extent because it was less hurt by lockdowns, but also because copper prices fell very sharply, but then, as you pointed out, are beginning to recover. So that's a bit of good news. On the financial and exchange rate front, I think something fascinating is happening that we need to keep an eye on. Historically, when you had big interest rate cuts in emerging markets, currencies depreciated and there was a panic, capital flowed out, financial markets did not like it. I think this is the first time since I can remember, certainly in the last 25 or 30 years, that you've seen lots of emerging markets having room to pursue very aggressive counter-cyclical monetary policies, and financial markets, in fact, are delighted. Chile has very, very low interest rates nowadays. For Chile, it's not quite the first time because we did more or less the same thing 10 years ago during the big financial crisis. But in other countries like Brazil, Brazil has been for decades the country with the highest interest rates in the planet. Brazil has a short interest rate around 2% today, and there's a boom in the stock market. And the real took, a beating in the beginning, but it's not doing terribly. So I think one thing we've learned in this pandemic is that emerging markets have more room for monetary independence than we thought. Now, this is, of course, the case as long as world interest rates are very low, so that money has no place to go, right? You can afford to have very low interest rates in Brazil and Chile as long as you have very low interest rates in the US and Europe. If that were to change going forward, of course, we're back in a very different ball game. Last but not least, on China and the new Cold War, there may be even a slight silver lining in that. I think, of course, having a new Cold War is bad for the planet. But if you happen to be, say, manufacturing in Mexico, and some of the American firms take production out of China and bring it to Mexico, that may not be bad. Similarly, say, for some agricultural exporters, when China slapped tariffs on US exports of farm goods, Argentina and Brazil benefited. So, there are these complicated general equilibrium effects which can point in all directions. And last but not least, on the politics, once again, I think this is really the key point, right? Will it be 1918 or will it be 1945? Who knows? If I had to put money on it, I think it may be more like 1918. For one reason that you mentioned, Ian, the world recovered quickly after 45 because the victors were willing to put money rebuilding the economies of the vanquished, as you pointed out. I don't see the rich world today with that kind of foresight. If anything, the attempts, say, to create new SDRs at the IMF or to create new lending facilities to have bigger official capital flows to emerging markets, they've gone nowhere. And that's largely because the US is without a leader, without a sound leader. The UK has tried, but doesn't quite carry enough weight nowadays, I'm afraid. So has France. So the kind of world leadership we need to do that sort of thing all over again seems to be missing in action. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, very much so. And I don't think a Democrat victory in November would change that dimension on China and globalization, because the one thing that seems to unite both political parties and in all the presidential candidates for them was anti-China, anti-globalization, and actually anti-tech as well. Just to pick up on the points and then add one other, interestingly enough, in terms of the general equilibrium effects, one of the things that might really hurt because of the new Cold War, in addition to not having an agreement on climate change, is that the Amazon will be even more quickly because China will go back to Brazilian soybeans, not using US soybeans. Another general equilibrium effect, of course, is going to be a huge reinvestment by China compared to the rest of the world in emerging markets. And I think the failure of the world to give money to emerging markets, less than 1% of the $10 trillion that's been allocated is going to emerging markets, is a real cardinal sin. Just on the strange times we live in, not only in terms of interest rates and emerging markets being able to build up high levels of debt and not feel the short-term pain, but of course the big disconnect between US markets, which are at all-time high, and the real economy, which is at an all-time low. How does one explain this? Is one of the fascinating things. Economists, where all our assumptions from January are now being rethought of. And I think that question of why is the stock market booming? And it's not only in the US, although it's mainly in the US, but Europe's also having very high equity values. So these price to earnings ratios are at record highs. That's not sustainable. And that reflects, I think, the concentration of the technology firms in the indices. They're doing extremely well. At least some of them are doing extremely well. And also this rapid rush, particularly of retail investors who are in the US and in Europe been given cash inflows and can't spend the money into markets. And that, I think, is storing up trouble for the future because that disconnect is also, like the interest rate and debt disconnect, it's a short-term phenomena.
Yeah. No, on that point, I think there are plenty of fascinating academic puzzles. I don't think we know the whole story. But I agree with you, one piece of the puzzle must be the behavior and the performance of tech firms. The stock market is doing really, really well as the US. And if you split it into tech and non-tech, or if you compare NASDAQ and non-NASDAQ, say, clearly NASDAQ is doing much, much better, right? So this is something to do with the fact that Amazon is booming and food deliveries at home are booming because we can't leave, so we order in, right? And this is a worldwide phenomenon, but the Amazons of the world are really there to capitalize on it. The other thing I think we've learned, but this is a tentative conclusion, is that central banks have more firepower than we thought they did, because the conventional wisdom before this crisis is, well, interest rates are pretty low, there's not much more than central banks can do. Central banks seem to be doing all kinds of things, and the markets seem to like it. But again, I think this is a bit of a tenuous equilibrium. This is a way I think about it. I'm going to get a little bit technical for 30 seconds. I think an enduring puzzle is, why does a country like the US or the UK manage to print so much money without any inflationary consequences? If you had told me, or if I told my students 10 years ago that the balance sheet of the Bank of England or of the Fed would grow by a factor of 4 and the price level would drop, you and I would have said that's impossible. Well, one reason why that is so, I think, is that when the interest rate is 0, £1 note and £1 worth of British government bonds are exactly the same thing, right? They both yield 0. And they're both liabilities of the UK government or the US government. So you can print a lot of money and do these very aggressive interest rate policies as long as the demographics and the fundamental determinants of interest rates are such that the world is in a trap of very, very low interest rates. That also means that you can borrow, and as long as the economy is growing faster than the interest rate, growth doesn't, debt does not accumulate as a share of GDP. So that's a very happy world as long as interest rates are very low. I have no idea when interest rates will go back to normal, maybe never in our lifetimes, but it's pretty clear that, with countries in the advanced world having debt to GDP ratios of 130, 140%, and of course, Greece and Japan being over 200, that is not sustainable if the world goes back to having normal interest rates. And the day that happens, of course, the kinds of economic policies and central bank policies that countries like Indonesia or Turkey or Brazil or Chile have been following become a much harder act to pursue, right? So you're absolutely right. I think it's good news, but with a very uncertain time horizon.
And I think that's absolutely right. I agree with you. It also has very strong distributional consequences. It penalizes savers at big time, and pensioners who've got fixed income. And that is going to be the time bomb as well. How do you match the growing pension liability? And I know Chile's in this head on at the moment, which was a source of discontent. But it's not only Chile, there's a huge problem across Europe, for Japan, for China. And that is creating speculative bubbles in real estate, in stock markets, etc. So it's not a healthy environment. It's not a long-term environment where savers are penalized by having low-risk assets. And that's where we are. So my sense is that there's going to be lots of reasons why governments try and get a bit of inflation back into the system. That means interest rates back positive, and it's just a question of time, not I think, whether that will happen, and that creates a very unstable environment.
Yeah, no, the impact of interest rates on pensions is absolutely key, and in Latin America and in Chile, it doesn't always get put into the public debate. There are many reasons why pensions are low, but a very important one, and a fairly recent one, of course, is that if you have a system in which you save when you're young and you draw a pension when you're old, the return on those savings is absolutely key. 20, 30 years ago, the real return on those savings in Latin America would be 5, 6, 7%, or more even. Today, that real return is 1 or 2%. Add to that the fact that people live much longer. Today, in a country like Chile, contingent on reaching retirement age, that is to say, contingent on becoming 60 or 65, depending on whether you're a man or a woman, your life expectancy is nearly 90. So if you retire at 60 and on average you live until 90, you have to pay for 30 years of pensions with a much diminished stock of savings because the return on those savings has been very low. This is a very key thing which typically gets missed in some of the very ideological discussions we have about pensions.
I used to be on the board of a big life insurance company and was very focused on this issue. I calculated that you have to save 100 times more, basically, than you would have had to save 30 years ago for an equivalent standard of living in your old age when you retire. The question is, where's the money going to come from? It has to come from consumption. That means much lower levels of consumption. That has all sorts of implications for the real economy and demand. Where's it going to go to? Where do you put the savings? Well, you use the savings into interest yielding assets. Now you can't do that. So you put them into the markets or into property. It means you have much lower transfer from the older generation to the younger generation. You don't want to pay for your kids' schooling or health or house because you need it for yourself. And they'll be very lucky to inherit anything when you're 90. And that's a bit late to be inheriting money to be a wealth transfer for people. So it has massive implications, and Chile's ahead of the game and therefore experiencing these in Latin America. Africa, of course, is a very young continent. Median age is 24, North Africa 20. But Europe is already up to, approaching 40, and Japan even higher. So all of these things are clashing with this interest rate environment, which is why I think when, the central bankers and the finance ministers, and you feel so proud that they can pull these interest rate levers, they are at the same time igniting fuses, the time bombs, which are going to come, not least on this pensions front.
And then we add one element to that, which is, you hail from South Africa. South Africa and Chile have one thing in common. They have lots of things in common, but one in particular, we have labor markets that work pretty poorly. South Africa probably even less well than Chile. And that means that you also have very erratic employment patterns, especially for young people.
And you can't which is another problem.
Exactly. So people don't have jobs. So to go back to the beginning of our conversation, and this is a bit of an obsession of mine, I always find myself coming back to this, how the labor market performs in the future is going to be absolutely key. And I think I really worry about the combination of the shock from the pandemic, the shock from automation and labor saving innovation, and the shock from bad politics, which can choose policies which may be sexy over the short term, but which do damage to job creation over the longer term. So you put all those three together, add to that the fact that kids haven't been to school in a long time, and therefore human capital formation is slowing down, and you could be in for a period of sustained rates of unemployment, very high rates of unemployment. And that's terrible for people's welfare, it's terrible for families' budgets. it's also terrible for the politics. One thing we know is that if the politics are pretty nasty nowadays, subject those political systems to 15 or 20% rates of unemployment, and the room for demagoguery and populism, which is high already, increases even further. That's why, if you ask me, would I put money on the 1918 scenario vis-a-vis the 1945 scenario? Maybe 1918 is a bit more likely. But before I get too gloomy, you mentioned that you didn't think the U.S. attitude toward the world would change very much under a Biden administration. I think it's partially right vis-a-vis China. I think clearly the political climate in the U.S. is such that a Democrat is not going to be very China friendly. But I would like to think, I hope I'm not entirely wrong, that with the Democrats in the White House, the U.S. attitude toward the IMF, the World Bank, international lending, SDR issues, debt forgiveness for low-income countries, all those things which are very important, very necessary, and which, of course, the Trump administration simply does not get it. I mean, they simply don't. They have no idea what this is about, and they're playing politics with it all. I'd like to think that if you get reasonable people back in the Treasury, reasonable people in the White House, those things would shift. So you may get a bit more help toward countries that need that help. Maybe not a Marshall Plan, but capital flows going to where that capital is needed. I think that would help the economies, but above all, it would help the politics.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. You would certainly, for the Bretton Woods institutions, for the multilateral system, Democrat presidency, I think, would be much, much more favorable. And to the World Trade Organization and World Health Organization. On the future of work, I have this group in Oxford that predicted that up to half of US jobs are vulnerable, and it's a massive issue. And we did some analysis of how people are voting according to their vulnerability to automation. And it really is the case that those that were most vulnerable to automation, particularly in the Midwest of the US, for example, were more likely to vote for Trump. So it has direct political consequences, and I think I know we're running out of time, but I would absolutely agree with your perception. On a slightly more positive note, what makes me optimistic about the future, and particularly the future of Chile, is people like you who can provide the leadership, BICE engaging and thinking about the world. It's a wonderful country, and by drawing on its people and the diaspora, I feel much better about its future.
Well, that's a very nice and optimistic note to end on. I tend to agree with you. Certainly, I agree with the notion that it's a wonderful country with a great deal of potential. But to take advantage of that potential, we have to improve our politics, I think. And one thing that Chile is going through, which is common to political systems worldwide, is a devaluation, I think, of technical expertise. Sitting here in London, I've been seeing a lot of that recently. That's also true in American politics. And of course, you can have a lot of accumulated human capital, but if the political system will not hear of it, the country may not get the benefit from all those, talented Chileans who've come to the US or the UK to do graduate degrees. We've been, over the last 10 or 15 years, 20 years, building a lot of talented human capital. We're a much more educated society than we used to be. Access to higher education has gone through the roof over the last 2 or 3 decades. We just need to make the policy and political decisions now to give those talented young people a chance.
Good luck to all of you. Buena suerte.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ian.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Wonderful conversation. Thanks a lot.
Bueno, amigas y amigos, espero que hayan disfrutado esta notable hora de conversación. Estoy seguro que varias de las ideas que escuchamos nos quedarán dando vuelta y con el correr de los días seguiremos madurando muchas de ellas. Esperamos encontrarnos muy pronto en otra interesante jornada de nuestros puentes hacia el futuro. Un abrazo y muchas gracias nuevamente.